Welcome back to the Majority Report. Michael Brooks here. Joining us now is Mika Utricht and Megan Day, two great writers for Jacobin Magazine, co-authors of the new book, Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism. Guys, thanks so much for being here. And you know, as always in these times, I hope that you're both safe and well.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. We're about as good as we can be, I guess.
Indeed. Indeed. So let me start with my only sort of how much, I mean, what could be bigger than electing the president of the United States?
That's a great question.
Yes.
That's a great question. Well, I think to start off with that, I mean, you are correct that actually it's a really big deal to potentially have had one of ours in the Oval Office. Like yes. I think that sometimes there are some people who, in order to make a point about the insufficiency of electoral politics, will sometimes downplay how incredibly monumental that would have been.
Yes.
So point well taken. And at the same time, it's also when Bernie said "not me, us," the slogan that he decided to lean into, he wasn't just like flattering us. Like he wasn't like, "I love you guys, we're going to do this together. It's you and me all the way, baby." I mean, he was actually articulating a theory of change that he has had for decades, for half a century, really, ever since he was like a member of the Young People's Socialist League. In fact, if you go look, there's this archival video of him winning a seat in Congress for the first time. And the first words out of his mouth at his victory party were, "Just so you know, it's not going to be Bernie Sanders alone in there that's capable of making the change that we need. It's going to be all of you." And that was in like 1990 or something. Yep. So, you know, he understands that it's actually not, it has to be bigger than Bernie. And we just tried to write a book that actually spelled out what that meant beyond sort of platitudes and give a sense of the actual work that needs to be done to consolidate, cohere, and strengthen various institutional and social forces to make it possible to affect change with or without one of our people in the White House. Obviously with would have been preferable, but what can you do?
Absolutely. Then what is well, first of all, then let's actually, before we get to the present, maybe you guys spend a lot of time in the book, which I really appreciate. I think actually threading a very specific, important needle about Bernie Sanders that for so long, and I think actually especially coming off of sort of Obama and, you know, just the very dysfunctional relationship built, I think, for a lot of people who came of age in the Obama era of sort of like, you know, it's one, literally the, you know, "I got this" meme. It's about one person who happens to be extremely cool, and that's sort of it, and that's great. And, you know, we haven't left that. I think, you know, a lot of the relationship to, you know, Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren really reflected that sort of, you know, devotion, adoration of particular individuals and brands. But then we went to this sort of like, you know, and I think was a very important course correction in some ways, like, hey, it's not about people, it's about policy. And there's some truth to that, but also, you know, policy exists in context. And I say this all as a way of saying that Bernie Sanders is flawed and has made mistakes like literally any other human being on the planet. I've actually been fairly critical of his how he's handled the bailout vote. I think there's actually legit criticisms there. But overall, this is actually an extraordinary leader who's done a hell of a lot for us and really does stick out in a very unusual and positive way. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with acknowledging that, particularly now as we think of him as a legacy figure. So can you, and I'll start with you on this one, Mika, can you talk about really specifically in the book how these two Sanders campaigns have really been a centerpiece of reshifting political terrain?
Yeah, I think that, well, for one thing, those of us who have been around the left for a long time know that in the past, like very recent past, the socialist left in the United States was completely marginal. We played basically zero role in the politics of this country. And that was a very bad thing for anybody who wants to, you know, live in a world of decency and dignity for the vast majority of the population. And Bernie, I mean, the reasons for that are structural, right? Like the deck is stacked against the socialist movement in the United States. We had a Red Scare whose purpose was to try to smash and destroy the socialist movement in the United States. And all of those things have created these structural barriers to the left playing a real role in U.S. politics. And Bernie is this singular individual who managed to, as you said, thread this needle of keeping those socialist politics alive, while, I mean, I guess he was still a marginal figure over the years, but he managed to move from, he managed to win elected office and move up the chain all the way up to the Senate. And so we have our first chapter of the book is the only chapter that's about Bernie, and we wanted to have a chapter about him because it is important to take stock of what this individual figure was able to accomplish. I mean, of course, there's plenty of objective forces that we can talk about that have led us to where we are, but the subjective forces of the Bernie Sanders campaign in particular, and Bernie Sanders as a historical political figure, are really important. I think that what probably, if you had to like guess how, where new progressive left populist energies might go, if somebody had asked you about it, like let's say 6 years ago, I think if you know the history of the United States, the role that the left has and hasn't played, you would probably guess that what would have been most likely in 2016 would be that somebody like an Elizabeth Warren would come along. They would see that inequality is enormous, and that people are angry about it in a kind of incoherent way. And so they would try to capture some of that energy and put it into like the kind of campaign that she ran, sort of like, a couple rhetorical bones, not a couple, significant rhetorical bones towards the what's wrong with the power of corporations and billionaires in society. But be fundamentally arguing for what you mentioned was Obama's way of campaigning. And arguing about what his role was, which is this sort of uniquely moral and competent and smart administrator who could steer the ship. And Bernie didn't argue for that. Bernie argued for a qualitatively different way of doing politics. He obviously called himself a democratic socialist, and he talked about the way that social change happened was going to come through millions of people being actually engaged in a mass movement to change things. And so I don't think we would have a reborn socialist movement in this country. We wouldn't have the reborn democratic socialists of America. We wouldn't have the kinds of, the small handful but important number of left elected officials who have been elected since Bernie's first campaign. I think all of that is can largely be attributed to the unique figure that is Bernie Sanders and the unique kind of campaign that he ran, a campaign that none of us would have expected would have ever had any real traction. I don't think, even those of us who are socialists, and not to mention like that it would not just get traction, but help spark a bunch of other things happening in American politics. So we don't know where that's going to go, but that's the situation we're in. It's a pretty unique one, and we wanted to sort of try to tease some of that out in that chapter on Bernie, because we do think that he is a unique and important, American political figure.